looking back with how they kind of butchered the underground areas in my opinion. These were meant to be a callback to the Mario Bros. Arcade game, which presumably takes place in a sewer. But the remake of Super Mario Bros. Added a background that more so resembles a cave or a mine shaft, which is fine as a change, but this particular design kind of clutters up the screen in a way that the original's flat black background didn't. So I'd say it's worse off for it. The changes also bleed into the game's physics, with Mario now not bouncing back down after breaking the block, something that actually negatively affects the level design originally made with the prequel in mind. I do like some of the little unnecessary additions too, though. Each level has a charming little intro image before it starts now, which is based on the same thing our Super Mario Bros. 2 did. And for whatever reason, they decided to add boss music to the castle-level Bowser encounters, even though they usually end in a matter of seconds. There's also a slight change to the overworld music in this version, with a little ad-lib being added to this part. Now, other than giving me a few benign topics to complain about, there is one thing that this remake collection did which is relevant today. It introduced us non-Japanese players to this little game, the infamous Japanese sequel to Super Mario Bros. 1 that the rest of the world didn't get because it was too hard. It's a piece of gaming trivia so well known and uninteresting at this point
We have
that
a
it's
favorite
itself
pen?
right to even point out how well known and uninteresting it is. But yes, the Super Mario Bros. 2 that we got was a reskin of a previously existing self-confessed Mario clone developed by Super Mario Bros. Development team. They added Mario characters to the already pretty Mario-reminiscent gameplay and sent it off to the overseas market while Japanese players were ripping their hair out over this thing. Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, as it's called outside of Japan, is a very literal follow-up to the first Super Mario Bros. In that it's not really a sequel to the first game's story, or its mechanics, or anything like that. It's a sequel to the first game's difficulty. The opening of the Lost Levels in essence poses the same amount of challenge as the first game's finale, and it gets progressively harder from there. As a result, it basically functions as a second half of Super Mario Bros. 1. It looks like Super Mario Bros. 1, it controls like Super Mario Bros. 1, it has the same 8-world structure as the first game, you're still saving Princess Toadstool from King Koopa, unlike the following sequels where their very simple plots are changed to be primarily about saving more than just the princess. It's all a retread of Super Mario Bros. 1. Well, there are a few slight changes. Some sprites and textures got a bit more detailed, the mushroom power-ups were designed to their more contemporary and/or first game's box art-inspired look with drawn eyes, and one full mechanic was introduced into a couple of levels, these wind physics sections. The infamous conceit of the Lost Levels is, of course, its unfair and kind of over-the-top difficulty. The levels have really counterintuitive design that's just meant to frustrate the player, and the developers made a few prank-like tweaks to the first game's rules to mess with you. The poison mushroom power-up that hurts you got its start here, and there's awkward-to-use springs that shoot you off-screen, forcing you to control where Mario lands without being able to actually see him. The game also uses your presumed awareness of the first title's secrets against you. There's the infamous reverse warp zone that, instead of rewarding you with the ability to skip to a later part of the game, as established in Super Mario Bros. 1, cruelly shoots you back to the beginning instead. If you're in any way acquainted with the Mario series, this is all fairly self-explanatory, so why am I mentioning the Lost Levels while supposedly talking about the first game being split into multiple parts? Well, a lesser, though still pretty widely known factoid about the Lost Levels is that its title, other than just referring to it being a regionally semi-unreleased game, possibly also refers to how a handful of the game's literal levels are actually repurposed from a previously released version of the first Super Mario Bros. Versus Super Mario Bros., a remix-type version of the game made for the arcades.
She's a catalyst. Fuck me.
For the most part, it's just the original game with small changes in level design to make it harder. It's an arcade game, so it's trying to eat up as much of your change as it can. This platform ends a block earlier, this 1-up isn't here, and to my dismay, the revered palette-swapped 1-up up there is replaced with a regular power-up. As a side note, Fire Mario's sprite actually looks different here. Instead of being red and white like in the original, he's red and bright yellow, which I think looks hideous. The same way there are slight changes to the levels between these two versions of Super Mario Bros. 1. The new stages that ended up making it into Lost Levels are also slightly altered in their move from arcade to home console. base design stays intact. It's through this game that the line between the first Super Mario Bros. And Lost Levels gets properly blurred.
Are you here to see
this
me,
version of the
Chief?
game is actually what inspired
Feel free to
the
take the
developers
time
make
to
the
look at the
Japanese
new
sequel be
supplies,
the way
too.
it is. So not only is Lost Levels functionally just an update to the first game, being about as much of a sequel to it as the New Super Luigi U DLC was to the base New Super Mario Bros. U game, really did not expect to bring up the Year of Luigi twice today, but the Lost Levels now definitively uses sections that belong to a version of its predecessor, making the two games' DNA hard to separate. And all of this on top of Lost Levels being marketed in this nebulous way in most of the world as almost a Super Mario Bros. 1 Part 2, rather than a real sequel to Super Mario Bros. 1. This differing overseas view of the game has over time affected Nintendo's own attitude towards it as a whole, being seen as inherently linked to the first game in a way that the following Super Mario Bros. Sequels aren't. The Lost Levels only ever gets re-released or remade in conjunction with the original, starting off, of course, with its initial remake on Mario All-Stars compilation, then continuing on into Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, where the Lost Levels courses are unlockables on top of the base Super Mario Bros. 1 rework, and for the series' 35th anniversary, the two games were again compiled and repackaged into that year's collector's novelty item release. Super Mario World and Super Mario
I'll go
Bros.
prepare the
3 got
campfire.
their remakes released
We
separately,
have a new
and
client
so
tomorrow.
did the overseas version of Super Mario Bros. 2. The Game Boy Advance version actually making noticeable changes to the level design, arguably once and for all solidifying it as its own game instead of just a
Why
reskin
can't I
of the
scroll
pre-existing
these?
one. And the original Super Mario Bros. Has been released and remade in a myriad of formats on its own over the years as well. The Lost Levels, the only installment in the original Super Mario Bros.
This is my direction.
To another game, more so than a separate game in its own right. I think I've so far made a reasonable enough argument for why and how these two games have come to basically be seen as two halves of a singular Mario installment. It's completely understandable if you call it a stretch or a technicality really, but I outlined it here mainly to show that what I'm about to talk about isn't the only noteworthy anomaly here. As I said moments ago, the first Super Mario Bros. Has had a huge amount of remakes and ports come out since its first release in 1985. And, well, Nintendo came out with one of these before Lost Levels, aka the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, even released. There was obviously versus
Penumbra Phantasm.
But I mentioned earlier there was a Game & Watch adaptation of the original Mario Bros. Arcade game, which in that case was basically its own separate video game with different mechanics and technically a different story. Well, the arcade game's successor, Super Mario Bros., ended up following in its footsteps, and also got a handheld LCD adaptation less than a year after the home console variant came. I can confidently say that this ridiculous thing is the single most interesting Game & Watch title that literally ever released. Since the Game & Watch systems were made with the simplest hardware possible, the first dating all the way back to 1980 on the dot, I suppose there's not much competition here. The game originally released as part of the limited and I suppose experimental sub-variant of Game & Watches called the Crystal Screen series, known for projecting the games onto a clear screen with no pre-printed background that the standard Game & Watches normally have. It was as gimmicky a gimmick can get. Don't get me wrong, I love useless shit like this as much as the next Nintendo pack, but there's genuinely no practical use for the Game & Watches to drop the back piece of plastic other than to maybe give it an optional backlight when you hold it against something that itself lights up, which, not to push the observation envelope too far here, but that is literally just what you do with every other Game & Watch as well. Only 3 games were released as crystal screens, and they would all go on to be re-released as the more standard widescreen Game & Watches with inbuilt backgrounds anyway, so this whole thing was kind of pointless in retrospect. The game itself is as faithful of a Super Mario Bros. 1 adaptation as a little LCD brick can muster. The plot outline is the same as in that game, and what it would be in Lost Levels. To my knowledge, it's also the first time that the plot was presented as a letter from the princess, something that would go on to become a tradition in the series moving forward. The game plays as a 2D auto-scroller, another Mario staple that made its debut here actually. An interactable level is constructed out of a series of vertical and horizontal dashes, similar to the way that numbers or letters are visualized on classic digital plots. Your objective is to run and jump through the simple outline of a level until you make it to its end, which, instead of being marked by Super Mario Bros.' traditional black holes, obviously, is instead represented by the screen finishing its scrolling and getting you to jump up or down to whichever platform Peach is standing on. The princess standing at the end of each level, despite being kidnapped by Bowser, and actually only being physically present at the end of level 8, is explained in the game's manual as her astral projecting herself into the first 7 areas, which is another one of those nonsensical lore tidbits that I'm just completely in love with. with you. An interesting addition allowed by the screen being still in these ending sections is Display's ability to present actual interactive moving platforms that carry you along with them to wherever you get. A style of level endings that was eventually revisited again in Super Mario Land for the Game Boy, which doesn't actually mean anything, I just find it kind of interesting. The console game's 8 worlds were unsurprisingly shrunken down to 8 levels here instead, all with different themes represented by unique level patterns. Themes all have canon names in the manual, some being normal, like Canyon and Maze, with others being either kind of unorthodox, like Gym, or having names that don't describe the area at all, like Hop and Beam, which is most likely a result of the manual's delightfully poor translation. The different level themes would themselves be more variety than what the Game & Watch games normally offer, but this flimsy thing is determined to impress, and actually features a handful of levels with unique one-off mechanics on top of that. It adapts the original's water level gameplay by giving you full vertical and horizontal control of Mario for one of the levels, and forces you to avoid getting stuck on this straightened, stacked environment instead of getting you to run and jump over it like in the rest of the game. Another level, the mistyped World 7A 3 choice, watch it, there are 3 choice, ends with the repurposing of warp zones from the console game, where you've got to pick one of the 3 pipes, 2 of which spit you back to earlier on in the level, and 1 ending the level off. The pipes reversing your progress instead of sending you forward is technically a precursor to backwards
But I
warp
like
zones
your
in
model
Lost
as it is.
or an adaptation of the looping castle level puzzles from the original. It's kind of a mixture of the two, really.
Firewall
One other connection
debugging
that literally no one
completed.
else cares about
You're
nor
under
me between
protection
this and
now.
Lost Levels is that this game actually predates Lost Levels' in-game
If
redesign
this
of the mushroom
scene
power,
could be
making this the first
reenacted,
Mario entry where there's
what
sprites
would
and
be...
eyes.
They
And
will
earth-shattering
behave.
great. Only the one-up variants return in this game, since Mario dies in a single hit, but what did fully return was how you get them. They somehow managed to stuff the mechanic of punching platforms from below in order to get the power-ups out onto this thing. It's obviously a lot less elegant on this display, with you basically just having to animationlessly mash the jump button under each possible platform you come across in the hope of the game spawning something. But it's neat that it's here regardless. The Invincibility Star is the other block item that returns from the console game. Making you obviously invincible against enemies who here are limited to randomly spawning bullet bills and lackitudes, the latter of which is crossed with the original game's hammer bros and those hammers instead of spinies. The one other obstacle type
Could have guessed I was light.
in Mario are these rotating rocks, which are adaptations of constant Mario Bros. They are once again possible to animate in non-scrolling segments only, as are moving platforms, and these segments are reserved for specialized interlude levels labeled as timer screens. They're single-screen obstacle courses with moving environmental hazards that are timed at the top of the screen using the Game & Watch's actual time display, otherwise known as the watch part of the Game & Watch when it's in idle mode. The timer screen sections are most likely meant to be stand-ins for the console game's castle levels. The final level referred to as Golden Road in the manual is basically a long continuous sequence of these screens that make up a large full-length level, just divided into smaller chunks, where the screen only scrolls to the next part once you reach the rightmost tile currently loaded in. I find this to be an especially novel way of adapting the traditional Mario gameplay for hardware as basic as this. Like, you can really tell developers put their all into this thing with how much variety there actually is.
The attack is over. The source has been identified and eliminated.
Clearly distinguishable levels
we did
and
it.
mechanics is really impressive for the time. The game even retains little touches from the original, like the previously highlighted detail where underground levels begin with Mario falling down to the floor from the top of the screen. And actually, the underground or castle levels feature a short music track of the famous Again, this is really impressive for the Game & Watch. Mario reaches the real princess at the end of Burning Road, being treated to little endgame love heart sprites around her, and a sprite of Bowser getting kicked out of his castle in the top corner. Due to how limited the hardware is, Bowser doesn't actually appear in the game, other than his likeness being used for the alarm animation in the opposite corner of the screen. but it's still
Let us
admirable that they
begin.
managed to sort
Keep
of
your
have him
distance.
accounted for on the Game
I'm
Watch,
sure you
since
don't
he's
want my
technically
misfortune
present in the
rubbing
game's
off
little
on you.
plot outline. After this, the game loops around to a slightly harder version of itself, with the level pattern loops stretched out to go on longer and enemies spawning more frequently, which is a similar feature to the harder version of Super Mario Bros. 1 that opens up once you beat that game on the NES, where the enemies are switched out for slightly harder ones. The Game & Watch version has a total of 9 loops of this, all incrementally harder than the previous one. Once you beat the final loop, the game presumably detonates or something. I don't know, I've never actually gotten that far. This game's story doesn't end here, however. As you can deduce, seeing this game's existence, the Mario series has an ongoing tradition of remaking and re-releasing its games. A lot. I already spoke about the many different versions of the first few Mario games earlier, well, specifically the first one, and so it probably won't come as a shock to find out that this game was also remade. Those of you with a good memory might recall me mentioning that the Crystal Screen Game & Watch titles would later be re-released under the so-called new widescreen series of Game & Watches, removing the see-through gimmick and adding a flat background onto the systems instead to align more with the standard models. Well, there was once a contest held in Japan for the release of Famicom Grand Prix F1 race. I must beg you to believe me when I tell you this was a racing game for the Famicom. The game itself isn't relevant for today's conversation, but the awards
If
of the
this
contest
scene
are. There was
could
a
be
limited amount of Game & Watches
reenacted,
made with Case Chamber
what
Famicom
would
Disk
be
Systems mascot as
your
awards for the contestants of this event. These Game & Watches were alternate versions of the LCD Super Mario Bros. Release, this time with the standard background and, more importantly, redesigned sprite work. They were a limited series made specifically for this event. Nintendo would later repackage this newer Game & Watch mechanism and release it to the wider public with a light blue outer design, which has since become the best-known version of the Game & Watch Super Mario Bros. To the point where many don't even know the original Crystal Screen version actually exists. The differences in visuals are mainly just to make the characters more akin to their initial game art designs. Since the original didn't have a background, they compensated for the possible lower visibility by making the characters blockier with more dark-colored components that would stand out more. The actual designs looked a lot more similar to not just the previously released Mario Game & Watch titles, but Game & Watch games in general, with Mario having that classic large head and smaller, slimmer body proportioning that the character of Mr. Game & Watch would be associated with. Details like his mustache being represented with clear negative space. The rework outlined the sprites instead, allowing for not just more detail inside the actual designs, but also appropriately shading everything in. Lackey Duke's cloud is now white, and Mario's mustache is black, as they're supposed to be. They also got rid of the kind of unsightly arrow designs that the Crystal Screen version had, which I'm not really sure what the function of was. This version of the game was later reworked yet again as part of Nintendo's Mini Classic series of Game & Watch titles, which played the exact same as their original counterparts, just sporting an outer shell design that looks more like a Game Boy and shrunken down to a way smaller size because these were also marketed as keychains. This made the sprites even smaller now than they were before. One of the sort of substantial things that this version did change is that, to my knowledge, the secret code for the originals, which warps you to the current difficulty loop straight away if you press the
Enjoy the release, please.
that or my version of this thing is buggy, which is very much possible. This does probably make it the weakest version of the game, though it is my nostalgic favorite because it's the one I had growing up, and I've been enamored with it ever since. It confusingly counts as a demake of a remake of a demake of a game that is ostensibly a semi-sequel, semi-adaptation of the Mario games that came before it. It's a real adventure this tiny little game went on, really. Bringing it back to the two console titles, I mentioned how they got, again, lump-released together as part of Mario's 35th anniversary. What I didn't mention is that this collector's item release was a handheld styled after a Game & Watch, called Super Mario Bros. Game & Watch. These two things have the same name. What's even weirder is that the port
It's a limited time release as well, don't forget.
Another port compiled onto this model. Of course, since it's a celebration of the Mario series, you can bet that Nintendo shoved ball onto this thing. The first ever Game & Watch game released in 1980 that has nothing to do with Mario. They slapped his face onto the screen and called it a day.
Updated version of the title Game & Watch Ball starring Mario.
And don't you worry, you can also play as Luigi if you press the A button for 5 seconds. The future is now. But seeing this right after talking about the 1986 Super Mario Bros. Game & Watch really drives it home how much more
Hopefully I'll
impressive
find some
nothing is
interesting
compared
news
to
material.
other Game & Watches. and why I think they probably should have just added that in here instead of ball. As trivial of a topic that this is, the question of why didn't they just port the Mario thing on the Mario thing for the Mario thing is basically people's only takeaway.
Oh, what the hell is this
re-release.
OSD?
I mean, it would have made my life easier today by letting me tie the 3 games together in a neat little bow, but alas, I can't. What I can do is answer the question I began with again. So, no. This game predictably isn't some secret 3-parter or whatever, but there are 3 different games that are either intentionally or essentially just different versions of Super Mario Bros. 1.
Come with me. Let's take them
All
down.
were released one after the other in pretty quick succession. It's a remnant of that era's muddier handling of video games and their marketing. Both the Game & Watch and the Japanese Mario 2 can most likely just be explained away as hasty and, for the latter, arguably half-hearted follow-ups to capitalize on the original game's success. Super Mario Bros. 3 being the actual true successor to it, with the middle installment being kind of problematic regardless of which version of Mario 2 you look at. If you take anything away from this, let it be just how crude the Game & Watch version is. I swear people would talk about this thing more as basic and inconsequential as it is really. I kind of wanted to use this topic as an excuse to shine a light on that game, because I do genuinely find it an interesting little piece of gaming history. Otherwise, 3 games that were left in here kind of made a really full picture of the quote-unquote before times, when the series was still finding its footing, and when new Mario installments didn't get to carry the smothering prestige that future ones eventually would. I'm sure having to sit through release upon release of repetitive half-sequels at the time probably wasn't clear and screaming either, though. While it's only human to sometimes miss the way things used to be, a vice I'm pretty obviously not immune to, I do feel the need to emphasize the importance of not reminiscing about the past too fondly. I personally love old school media, hence why I'm talking about it right now and will continue to talk about it in the future, but I also appreciate seeing things evolve and improve, and I think throughout the past however long I've been talking for now, I've sort of red herring the obscene amount of remakes and remasters and re-releases and re-skins and re-references to older installments found around here. The mere existence of what is basically 3 Super Mario Bros. 1s alone shows you that Nintendo has a possible teeny-tiny habit of not letting things go. And not just in relation to Mario either. Seeing that the habit could be traced as far back as this, I'd say they could do with ditching the pattern sooner than later, something we should welcome with open arms. And now, since I know how to end this, I'm going to finish off by ranking all the mushroom sprites in these 3 Mario games from worst to best. Enjoy. 8. 1-Up. SMB1. 7. Poison. It's not as bad as the All-Stars one. 6. Super Lost Levels. 5. Crystal Screen. I hate that the white screen one has a mouth. 4. Super SMB1. 3. 1-Up Lost Levels. It's kinda ugly, but it grew on me. 2. Underground 1-Up SMB1. 1. Underground 1-Up Lost Levels. Congratulations.
You did a good job controlling my strength this time.
I don't need to get it perfect.
Are you here to entertain me? That's great.
If this scene could be reenacted, what would be your choice? Your only destination. Please enjoy the show.
D-Matrix, activate! Overflow! Warning!
Listen to its whispers. Death is your only destination.
Overflow! Warning! Enjoy the overflow! Warning! Overflow! Warning! Overflow! Warning! D-Matrix, active. Enjoy the release! Overflow! Warning! Enjoy the release! Overflow!
Please enjoy the show. Please enjoy the show. Death is your only destination.
D-Matrix, activate! D-Matrix, activate! Overflow! Warning! Enjoy the release! Overflow! Enjoy the release! Overflow! Warning!
Is your only destination.
The attack is over. The sword...
I'll relieve them of pain.
Firewall debugging completed. You're under protection, Manti. Go!
They will behave.
I should switch to a cooler battle model next time.
If this scene could be reenacted, what would be your choice?
Huh, what happened to the other one?
Enjoy the release.
Please enjoy.
D-Matrix, activate death.
Overflow. Warning!
Listen to its whispers.
Overflow. Warning!
Enjoy the release.
Overflow. Warning!
D-Matrix, activate.
Overflow. Warning!
Enjoy the release.
Overflow. Warning!
Listen to its whispers.
Overflow. Warning!
D-Matrix, activate.
Listen to. Please enjoy the show.
D-Matrix, activate.
Death is your only.
Enjoy the release. D-Matrix, activate.
Listen.
Overflow. Warning!
Enjoy the release.
All dreams vanish at this moment.
Dude, I can't tell how to use the cheats. I guess the cheat only affects... I thought there was something that affected her directly.
Death is your only destination.
Overflow. Warning!
Death is your only.
Overflow.
Enjoy the release.
Overflow. Warning!
D-Matrix, activate! D-Matrix, activate!
Enjoy the release.
Overflow. Warning!
Listen to its whispers.
Overflow. Warning! Overflow. Warning!
Not gonna get a high score.
Enjoy the release.
Listen to its whispers. Suffer no longer.
You came just in time. Ruina just made some sugar-free cheese roll cake. Would you like to try it? Does it really taste like chewing wax?